Brilliant. Great. So the subject of this morning's masterclass is we're going to be looking at GLP-1 agonists, this sort of new range of essentially they're being quoted as being sort of appetite suppressing medications, but they were originally designed for treating diabetes. And we're going to be looking at the impact they have in potentially improving or even worsening emotional and binge eating. And we're going to sort of be going over whether they're harmful, helpful, or somewhere in between. Okay. So content of this masterclass this morning, central focus of the presentation will be sort of an exploration of the role of these drug treatments as a potential tool to address emotional eating. But we're going to be looking at exactly what these treatments are, the theoretical use of these drugs in addressing emotional eating and binge eating, and some of the evidence that we have so far for their use in that application. And then we are also going to be looking at the real world application and the reality of these drugs for treating sort of emotional eating and binge eating, and even maybe sort of talking a little bit about their role in weight loss as well. And like I'd said before we sort of started the recording for the presentation, I was involved in one of the initial behavioral change units that helped sort of people to make those lifestyle adaptations whenever they were introducing these medications. And I was sort of involved in the initial rollout of these drugs in the UK, and sort of got a first-hand experience as to how things started off quite positively and quickly spiraled out of control whenever angel investors got involved, and profit became more of a priority over people. Okay. Um, but we'll save all the juicy stuff for later on. We'll start off on the maybe less exciting stuff, which is um, what exactly are GLP-1 agonist drugs. So these drugs are a kind of medication that essentially mimics the effect of a hormone called glucagon-like peptide 1, which is naturally produced in the gut in response to, say, like just having kind of like regular food and exercise. The function of GLP-1 is that it helps to regulate your blood glucose levels and essentially helps to promote a feeling of fullness. Um, Whenever it comes to these drugs, there is some quite promising early data, especially for the treatment of diabetes, particularly type 2 diabetes, and even potentially reversing type 2 diabetes. And then, as a sort of a subsequent byproduct of that, because they were seeing such improvements in diabetes, but that seemed to also be mediated partially um, by weight loss. Um, Sorry, guys. Just need to make sure that new people coming in are muted. Um, then they started to roll out these GLP-1 treatments as a potential option for treating obesity, and the results have actually been quite promising for that as well. Um, one of the one of the sort of the most prominent takeaways and consistent findings in these trials has been um, a reduction in overall food take, or an observed reduction in overall food intake, and self-reported feelings of being more in control around food, or a reduction in sort of what's commonly coined as food noise, which is this sort of continual, quite pervasive um, thought pattern around food, what you're going to eat, when you're going to eat, you know, where you're going to find certain things, and controlling portions, and it becomes sort of quite an overwhelming um, set of thoughts that you know, no pun intended, tends to consume most of your day, um, and that can actually be quite a triggering element for overeating, emotional eating, and binge eating. But essentially, that benefit to both controlling actual food intake and reducing that food noise, that has led to some speculation that these medications may be potentially useful in the treatment for binge eating behaviors. Um, so we're going to have a wee look into that, but firstly, I just wanted to sort of quickly look at what are the actual mechanisms of action that underlie the benefits of sort of taking these drugs and how they actually impact us. So this is basically how it works. So the mechanisms of action which underlie the sort of the results we see from these GLP-1 treatments. So one of the main ones is going to be the stimulation of insulin secretion. These GLP-1 agonists increase insulin secretion from the pancreas in response to elevated blood glucose levels. Insulin sort of serves essentially like, I think I've mentioned this in previous presentations, but insulin is sort of like the friend that knows the bouncer that helps you get into the nightclub. So having um, more insulin or what's sort of coined as sort of heightened insulin sensitivity tends to be more beneficial because it means then that our blood glucose levels are better controlled overall and better regulated. So they are, but essentially insulin acts as a way of helping to shuttle glucose into the cell. So it does. Another benefit of the GLP-1 agonist, or another mechanism of the GLP-1 agonist, is that they suppress glucagon release. So glucagon, which is another hormone, a hormone is basically just like a signaling molecule that tells the body to turn things off, turn things on, to increase the rate of something, decrease the rate of something, to start producing something or produce less of something. That's essentially what hormones do. It's produced by the pancreas and it raises blood sugar by signaling to the liver to release any stored glucose. GLP-1 agonists help to suppress glucagon release when blood sugar levels are high, which helps to then further contribute to the stabilization of blood glucose levels. One of the other sort of key benefits of these drugs is their impact on delaying gastric emptying. So that's essentially just how quickly food moves through the digestive tract, particularly from the stomach to the intestines. This this essentially prolongs digestion, um, leading to a slower rise in blood glucose levels, but ultimately a more sort of like an extended sense of fullness or satiation, which ultimately, in theory, should help to then reduce um, food intake over time. So it should, in theory. But we'll see that that's not always the case when it comes to sort of emotional eating and binge eating, which can sort of override that. And then the final mechanism to mention is the impact that these drugs have on the brain's appetite centers and reward centers. So GLP-1 agonists act on receptors in the hypothalamus, which is the region in the brain that regulates hunger. This then leads to enhanced sort of satiety signals, attenuation of hunger and cravings, and can make it easier to ultimately adhere to a calorie controlled diet and facilitate weight loss. Okay, so that's essentially how the drugs work. I think sort of the key ones are going to be the impact that they have on regulating blood glucose and delaying that gastric emptying. Those seem to be the two more significant factors that sort of lead to most of the results that we see, or most of the changes that we see whenever people start these treatments. So, can GLP-1 agonists address binge eating behaviors or emotional eating behaviors? So, let's have a wee look at the data that we've got. So, while the data that we have for these drugs on treating diabetes and obesity is promising, um, it's important to note that, sorry, just someone else just joined. It's important to note that any of the data that we have so far that would indicate that these drugs might be useful in addressing eating behaviors, particularly the likes of emotional eating and binge eating, um, has been met with extreme skepticism and critique, really, for the potential of doing more harm than good. Although we'll talk about why that is, but it seems to be a bit counterintuitive to the data that we actually have. So, which is why it's important that we first kind of cover why some people are actually still supporting its use as a treatment for binge eating. So, the initial studies that directly looked at the use of these drugs to improve sort of emotional eating, binge eating outcomes, they were essentially animal model studies. So, animal model studies, for the most part, are going to involve rodents and sort of lab controlled rodents, often sort of genetically modified. Um, and really the reason for that is that it's a lot easier to control sort of what's happening in the life of a mouse than it is for the life of a person because you can't necessarily stick a person in a cage for 6 months and poke and prod at them. So needless to say, though, the relevancy of the data that you would achieve from animal models is particularly in the realm of something like emotional eating and binge eating is sort of like, well, I would say it's like practically worthless, as the actual pathology of binge eating is much different in comparison between, say, like a mouse and a human being. So it is. And that opinion, which I sort of held with a bit of skepticism whenever I first started seeing these studies coming out, was backed by a relatively recent meta-analysis. So just quick sort of description of what that is. A meta-analysis is sort of like a collation of a whole range of different studies under the same subject. And essentially what they do is they collect all the data, all the findings, and they produce an average of those. Now, it's a bit more complex than that, but essentially what it's trying to do is to provide somewhat of a an unbiased kind of consensus effect, basically from everything that we have so far. Um, and the thing to note in that meta-analysis was that the authors found um, that many of the studies that have been used would frequently describe um, the behaviors as binge-like instead of binge eating behaviors, which is a wee bit of a red flag. And also that would potentially indicate that those behaviors were primarily driven by dietary deprivation, um, rather than what we would typically see in sort of like human models, which would be um, emotionally driven episodes of binge eating. So they would, and for reference, whenever you're looking at that, I mean, the data would indicate that depending on the study that you're reading or the population that's being evaluated, the data would indicate that anywhere between sort of like the high sort of like 60%, I think it's like 60, 68, 69% up to even 100% of emotional eating or binge eating episodes are attributed to low mood as opposed to sort of dietary deprivation. So just to be aware of that. Basically, animal drivers for binge eating are very different from human. So we do have to sort of have a heavy dose of skepticism when it comes to taking that data and seeing these treatments as um, a useful option for benefiting those who sort of are dealing with these behaviors. So we do. So um, putting those studies to one side, there actually are a few studies in humans that have also investigated these GLP-1 treatments. One randomized control trial, which essentially is looking at two groups. One of them is sort of provided the intervention, the other one is typically provided an alternative or a placebo, just to see which has the effect, if there is an effect observed. One of these studies has directly explored this drug intervention as a treatment option for binge eating, and the study found that recipients did show a greater numerical reduction in binge eating frequency and a higher rate of cessation of binge eating, but the findings were not significant. So essentially, what you can take from that is some people benefited from it, and sort of the vast majority of the participants did not. or at least didn't see any significant improvements. Um, it's also important to note that the population or the participants included in this study, while described as binge eaters, had very low baseline binge frequency. Um, so basically, it would be sort of more once in a blue moon rather than a sort of a more habitual behavior, which tends to be sort of what we would um, maybe typically observe in sort of binge eating disorder anyway, because that would need to be um, binge eating episodes of potentially at least once a week to I think now the definition has changed slightly depending on sort of where you're sort of looking, and that might be 2 to 3 times a week. So once in a fortnight or once a month is not necessarily a good kind of barometer to measure that against. It also doesn't really allow for you to sort of doesn't really give the intervention kind of like a fair shake because the episodes are too infrequent to really test the effectiveness of it. So they are. So other studies have also recorded improved binge eating scale scores. That's the severity and frequency of behaviors. But these have been found in um, populations that have been described as obese at sort of starting point, as well as that. Um, it's important to note that those participants were also enrolled in weight loss treatment facilities at the time as well. And so we're having regular appointments with health professionals and sort of receiving other treatments at the same time. So again, we're not really given the drug treatment like a fair sort of shake, if you know what I mean. So again, you're not really seeing what it would genuinely be like. Um, One of the other major concerns with that too, and this is where it gets a wee bit more complex, is that the participants were reporting, sorry, greater dietary restraint and experiencing weight loss, which may have then made them feel artificially more in control around food and have sort of a heightened overall mood, at least in that sort of temporary state while they were undergoing this weight loss treatment, um, which may then have mitigated some of the risk that would have contributed to the binge eating episodes sort of occurring whenever we look at that sort of those data that would sort of indicate that like 70 to 100% of binge eating episodes are because of low mood. So the person's feeling better and more control around food because they're losing weight and they're on these drugs. So that again, it's like there's two sides to that coin. There's the people who would support it, which would say, well, that's exactly what we were hoping for. And then there's the people who are skeptical of them, i.e. me, who would say that that sort of imposed external deprivation is great, but well, not great, but that sort of external imposed deprivation is yes, that might work for a short term, but then what happens whenever the person's no longer on the medications, and that would be sort of the primary concern with that. Um, so beyond the lack of kind of convincing data that would support GLP-1 agonists for improving binge eating outcomes in individuals who are binging in part due to physical drivers, so having that sort of deprivation induced binge eating, like they're um, that kind of like restrict binge kind of cycle, which can also be emotionally driven, but that tends to be sort of like physical elements of that. So where the person's food intake is so low that the more sort of like primordial parts of their brain are sending really strong signals to then seek out food because it's concerned about survivability and thinks that it's in maybe like a famine like environment or state. Um, uh, it's important to note that there's little to no data to suggest that these treatments could help those who binge eat predominantly due to emotional drivers. And like I said, that would be the vast proportion of people um, who experience binge eating episodes, those are emotionally driven for the most part, not physically driven. Um, and I think it's also important to highlight as well that we know that other forms of intervention that are meant to target overeating or binge eating behaviors are relatively ineffective long term as well. Um, the most popular one to sort of bring up would be the likes of bariatric surgery. Um, so whenever you look at the studies on that, irrespective of the form of bariatric intervention, so whether it be like um, whether you've got like the sort of the gastric bypass or gastric sleeve or um, all the like you'll know you'll have heard of like having your stomach stapled or tummy tuck or something like that. Um, those would all be like forms of bariatric surgery. But whenever you look um, at the data on those, you'll still find that people can eventually end up regressing back to overeating, emotional eating, and even binge eating, even when they are in those very sort of like now restricted states, where their actual physiology has been altered. The drive to binge is so potent that it can supersede even something like physical alterations. So the hopes of, say, like a drug, being able to sort of combat that is, you kind of have to use your common sense to think that it's probably not going to stand much of a chance. So it's not in those situations, and then that can become quite dangerous very quickly. So it can. Um, the way that particularly whenever you look at that sort of delayed gastric emptying effect, if someone was to binge or eat like a huge volume of food whilst experiencing that physical impact, you would probably see symptoms that wouldn't be too dissimilar to bulimia because they wouldn't be able to process that food quickly enough. So then food would begin to start being thrown back up again, because the gastric chamber is being sort of overloaded at that stage. So anyway, very doom and gloom. Basically, the data to support its use for improving eating behaviors and binge eating is in its infancy. Supporters are taking what we have and running with it. Maybe um, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not naive. Um, maybe they're being a wee bit ignorant to how everything kind of really works when it comes to emotional eating and binge eating. And I think those who are skeptical of it, um, a lot of that is because whenever you look at what would actually contribute to emotional eating and binge eating, those underlying drivers aren't being addressed. In fact, for the most part, they're being reinforced because deprivation is part of that. Um, and if the person was feeling deprived and feeling like they were unable to eat, that might put them in an even sort of lower mood state and would then maybe perpetuate that food noise even further and put them in a more kind of vulnerable position where they might end up binging and then having to throw up. And, it sort of becomes a very kind of like harmful spiral of behaviors then at that stage. So it does. So anyway, it's raining here, so I am a bit more doom and gloom than I normally would be first thing in the morning. So okay, so the reality of these GLP-1 drugs and binge eating and emotional eating. So like I said, so I do have a bit of first-hand experience with this. Um, Now, I would say that my experience should not trump any kind of like clinical data. I would always say that like n equals one is the worst study that you can do, because we're all unique. So it's not fair to just say that, well, this worked for me, so it works for everyone, or I seen this, so it must be universal. Um, but I do think it would make sense for me to share at least my opinions or my experiences, you know, with these drugs and having worked with individuals on a one-to-one basis who were using these drugs and having had, sort of a good kind of like nerd out at the literature to see sort of where we're at with everything. Like I said, I was involved in that initial rollout of the behavioral change units of these drugs being first introduced in the UK. So I've seen the positives and I've seen the negatives of these drugs being used. So whenever we first started out, um, the screening net, so to speak, for people who were able to access these drugs was very tight. You needed to not only provide your health history, but you also needed to have sign off from your GP before you could start these drugs. And you would also have to adhere to um, think it was either weekly or fortnightly appointments with sort of your coach and your pharmacist at the time as well, to make sure that you were using the drug appropriately and things weren't sort of getting out of control safety wise. Um, Now that very quickly span out of control whenever these drugs really started to take off. So there was maybe like a 3 to 4 month period where things were actually like sort of quite positive. Um, and then these drugs really sort of blew up overnight. A lot of that was coming from um, popular stories of celebrities having used them. Um, I do remember um, two in particular. I'm pretty sure it was everyone's favorite, Kim Kardashian. And then I also think there's quite a few stories about Elon Musk as well at the time. So we were getting quite a widespread range of both men and women of all ages, all backgrounds who were coming through. But we were very quickly being overwhelmed with the amount of people who were seeking the use of the sort of the drugs and sort of the behavioral change coaching as well. Um, and then what happened was that very quickly angel investors began to get involved in the process. So you're seeing a lot of money flowing in to the company and to this sort of this new um, not really an industry, but new sort of like arm of the health and wellness industry. And it had sort of very quickly began to spiral out of control, where that quite um, stringent screening net that we had began to have a lot of holes develop in it. And we were getting all manner of people through who hadn't had sort of GP sign-offs or anything at that stage. Folks who were dealing with who were already struggling with like binge eating or emotional eating or bulimia and things like that. And I think the worst case I had was a lady who was very clearly anorexic, who now had access to the highest dose of these medications because she had fabricated her screening questionnaire and said that she'd already been taking these drugs for, you know, 9 to 12 months, which wouldn't really be possible because they weren't actually available, um, for that long yet in the UK. And so she went straight on to the highest dose, and it took over a month to actually have her access to the drugs removed. So it was, yeah, it was pretty brutal. So it was whenever this thing was getting off the ground. So it was, but the reason why I wanted to sort of share that was because of how I find that these things tend to be sort of misused or misappropriated. And again, like just because the clinical data is providing sort of information to indicate that they might be beneficial in sort of real world scenarios, like I would say that they're causing more harm than good. Um, Like I worked with a lot of folks. I ended up working with a lot of folks who struggled mightily with their eating behaviors. And whilst many of them sort of did reduce, the frequency of maybe emotional eating episodes or binge eating episodes, the minute they came off those drugs, the episodes would return, and they were more severe and more frequent than they were before because everything was externally imposed on them and they hadn't really done the work in the interim to sort of address what was causing those issues. Um, and even whenever they were on the drugs, we were still seeing some people who were presenting with sort of fairly habitual um, emotional eating, binge eating episodes, because again, like the drive to overeat, binge eat will more often than not supersede anything that's going to come to try and stop it. So it will. And that's one of the big challenges of working with those. Um, so anyway, my whole, I guess, view on it is that these GLP-1 agonists treat symptoms short term, but not the root cause. And I sort of would often describe them as being like my sort of, I think it's an analogy, not a metaphor. Not too sure. I'm a health, nutrition training guy, not an English talking guy. I would often describe them as sort of being like given a person who has like a severely broken leg, like a wheelchair, and they're tasked with running a marathon. So all well and good that they're using the wheelchair as they start the marathon, but then what happens whenever the wheelchair gets taken away, and they're sort of left abandoned a couple of miles into a marathon with no one there to help them, everything's just going to get worse from that point onwards, because the leg hasn't been healed, hasn't been addressed, hasn't been rehabilitated, and now they're left stranded with no support. So not the right support. So that would sort of be one of my main concerns. I would also say that there's obviously cost and access risk. They are quite expensive. Um, I think the UK probably has the most affordable pricing band of these drugs, but if you were to go to the US, I mean, you're talking thousands a month, like a month, to access these things. And I'm not too sure how, because the US system, healthcare system's all over the place. But I'm not too sure if these drugs are covered on insurance most of the time or not. I think in certain situations they would be, but for the most part, people are forking out this amount of money for them. There's also the risk of dependency on the drugs. Um, Again, people become so acclimated to having that externally imposed satiety that they then become totally sort of like out of touch with their own hunger and satiety cues and never really learn to sort of get familiar with them. And then there's also that kind of like mental dependency too, where it's like I can only really succeed if I'm using them. Um, long term uncertainty. I think with that, um, really what I'm referring to is that there's no guarantee that any changes will be retained in the long term if you come off the drugs. But also, there are other risks that these drugs may present with too. A lot of people tend to severely undereat on these medications, and that would carry certain risks for particularly the loss of lean muscle mass and loss of bone mass density as well. And I'd say that one of the things that you would observe quite often is loss of menstrual cycle, um, in sort of quite a few of the women that I work with when I was sort of in that behavioral change unit. And I think the biggest concern for me with that, and I'm obviously, you can tell by the look of me, a regular menstrual cycle is not something I have to contend with personally, but I do understand, the sort of the importance of it from a physiology side of things. And those people were more interested in the weight loss that they were experiencing than they were with the fact that they were in such a depleted state that their hormones were essentially through the floor, and that's concerning. which then probably folds in the potential for misuse. And I think there's sort of um, plenty of avenues you could look down for potential for misuse. And then the final wee concern that I would have is short-term appetite suppression. So again, while the drugs might reduce cravings and overall food intake in the short term, that suppression might not be sufficient for actually overriding those really strong and potent urges to sort of emotionally eat or binge eat. So they might not. In conclusion, so the GLP-1 agonists may help to reduce binge eating episodes for some individuals in the short term by curbing appetite and stabilizing blood sugar, but they are um, far from a panacea to the issue. Um, while they are capable of addressing symptoms and behaviors in the short to sort of medium term, or at least as so far as you're on the drugs, even in some cases, that doesn't tend to work. Both both data and hands-on experience support that these are likely ineffective long-term, and binge eating behaviors will, or binge eating or emotional eating behaviors, or any real form of sort of like unhealthy behavior will likely return and potentially worsen. And you could even argue that the behaviors that the person is sort of exhibiting while they're on the drugs are still unhealthy because they're just the pendulum's just swinging from one extreme to the next, where they're chronically overeating to chronically undereating, and likely not fitting in uh, plentiful, nutritious food sort of um, along that journey. Overcoming emotional eating or binge eating requires addressing emotional, behavioral, and psychological components through a broader holistic approach, alongside building a healthy relationship with food. And in my view, constructing a long-term vision for the person to embrace a lifelong journey towards a healthier, happier version of themselves. And these drugs may not necessarily be a part of that. They might be a potential, like I said, an impetus or a driver for change in some folks. But I would be hesitant to say that they're going to solve all the world's problems. So I would. Cool. Hopefully that was interesting. Uh, any questions, guys? I'll ask everyone to unmute and we can all. Everyone's still awake?
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
very much so.
Yes. I found it very interesting. Yes.
It's always hard to know because everyone's like, whenever you're muted, it's so quiet and I'm talking to myself in a room. It's hard to know if everyone's just like,
No.
you know, especially on something like this because I know there was a lot of sciencey stuff, so it can be a wee bit.
Yeah. Well, what you have said, Jamie, is exactly what my friend who's a diabetic specialist has said. Everyone wants a quick fix, but it's not going to get rid of the pandemic we have of obesity in the UK. 80% of the patients that come to see him with type 2 diabetes are obese. Isn't that sad? And they have aged from 15, kids from the age of 15 up to whatever age, men and women.
Yeah.
Sad. I found it particularly interesting because I have a friend, and I, suggested him to join TSD because, of course, he's been going up and down with his weight for a long time. And he was contacted, and then he said, "Oh no, because it's too expensive, whatever." So, and then he said, "Oh, but now I've applied to the doctor to have this medicine," and say, "You sure this is the right medicine for you?" And to be honest, during your presentation today, you just confirmed my fears. So that is something that will not help him, but it's difficult to convince people.
The one thing I found is that like don't get me wrong, I'm actually quite a fan of these medications. I think there is definitely scope for them to make a significant change and to put a bit of a dent in the seemingly never ending worsening trending upward little arrow that's telling us that more and more people are becoming overweight and obese every year in the UK. I think there is going to be a potential for that to work. I think the problem is its use. That's the problem.
It's abuse, you mean?
Yeah,
because I would
it's
just say my friend is taking them in Cyprus, yeah,
mhm.
but she has a dietitian, she has a doctor. Okay, this
Mm.
is all free on the Cypriot NHS and or the equivalent of the NHS, and they've done everything with her from sleep apnea to exercise program to weighing her every month, you know, going to see her. So it's all a holistic approach. But the problem you've got in the UK is the NHS is completely stretched, you know, but if they looked at more prevention rather than cure, maybe invested money in prevention, yeah, things might change. So my friend who is a diabetic specialist is writing a paper he's getting a steering committee together where he wants to look at alternative with Western medicine to help people maybe move forward. In fact, he's asked me to join that steering committee because of my Ayurveda experience. But I think the problem is in the UK, we don't do prevention here, do we? Very
No,
well.
and the problem with it is that obesity and how it ultimately manifests is very complex. It's the same with binge eating. I'm going to see if I can get you this image to show you all the contributing factors to obesity, and your mind will be blown whenever you see how much you have to contend with. But I would also say that it's very important that you look at this and realize that, you know, all of you that are making progress on your own journeys, these are all the things that you're having to overcome as well. So I'm going to see if I can find that for you, because it's actually quite cool. Now, bear in mind, what I think is cool, you know, not everyone's going to think that's cool, but I live with it. So do let's see if I can get it. There's like a really right. Ask me questions while I'm doing this, guys, so that there's not awkward silences.
Yeah. You were talking about gastric sleeves a little bit, and two of my friends have had those done. Yeah. I think for me with those, it's the lack of nutrition you get because you can't take supplements, you can't do a lot of things once you've had one.
Yeah, those surgeries are actually quite barbaric. So they're actually I would be surprised if they continue with them.
What, gastric sleeves?
Any kind of gastric surgery, you know, I'd be surprised if they're still being widely used in the next 10 years, because the one thing about these drugs is that whenever you compare them side by side to bariatric surgery, they tend to be more effective, less invasive, and have less side effects, and they're cheaper. So it's kind of like, what's the argument then for the bariatric surgery? And it's like, there isn't really any, you know, like I think like the average cost
Oh,
is in,
11,000 pounds,
yeah,
12,000 pounds.
it's in around sort of like the 10 grand figure. Whereas like these medications, while they are expensive, you know, relative to that, wouldn't be that expensive, you know.
My
So
friend had it done and they sent her home 2 days later. And thank God I was with her because I think she would have died.
yeah, that's one of the big risks of those is
Yeah.
that sort of initial period. You do see a lot of people becoming very ill very quickly, and it's not necessarily because of like the lack of sort of like the nutrition factor. It's actually because there tends to be sort of like a relatively high risk of complications with the surgery.
But there's no support afterwards. A surgeon's a surgeon, does the work, and then
Oh yeah.
they check your scars are okay or whatever.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
That's the joys of the NHS.
No, they had it done privately.
Oh,
You know?
that's pretty bad.
Yeah.
That's pretty bad.
Yeah.
Maybe stretch for a refund there. Where is this thing? Does anyone have any questions about the presentation itself? Did everything make sense, or?
Yeah.
Oh, everything makes sense. Yeah.
Sure.
I think what I've learned is there's no quick fix. If you do it slowly and properly, and as we're doing it sustainably and learning new things each week and each month and then gradually progressing, so it becomes a lifestyle change rather than the quick fix.
Yeah, and I think you just need to sort of ask yourself, you know, did I get to where I'm at overnight, or did this take time? You know, and then you'll quickly find that this is sort of a result of kind of years and years of maybe sort of like living a certain way or treating yourself a certain way, whether that be internal, external, or a mix of the both. And so it naturally takes a bit of time because you sort of have to reverse course on that and then become comfortable with this gradual change in identity that's going to support those changes long term, you know. For those of you who don't sort of work with me, like the things that I would always say is this whole process is not too dissimilar to like whenever you're learning how to drive. So whenever you're starting out, you probably don't ever think that you could be someone who does drive, you know, because you're starting off in your lessons and you're like, I'm totally like, I have no idea how everyone else does this. You know, so then you go from someone who's learning how to drive, thinking they'll never be able to do it, to gaining confidence and experience in those lessons, you know, feeling like you're at a stage where you can maybe go and sit your theory test or go and sit your practical test. Then you're out in the road for the first time by yourself. You know, you're quite independent then at that stage, gaining your confidence. And then a few years of that, you very quickly find yourself just being like, no, I drive. You know, so you've gone from someone who would never believe they could to someone who just totally accepts this is who they are. It's the same with like your health. You know, you go from someone who's like, I could never be healthy. I've failed every diet I've ever done, blah, blah, blah. To then you find the approach that actually works for you and you work through that sort of transition. And then soon you realize, you know, you come out the other side of it, it's like, I am healthy. You know, I'm a healthy person who does healthy things and takes care of myself. You know, like I would say I'm a driver, but I can't parallel park. So I don't know. Getting there. Parallel parking's too scary. I don't want to wreck my car.
Takes
Jamie?
practice.
Yes. I lived in London for a while and had to do it all the time because you had to find a parking space. This is before all the restrictions years ago. I got quite good at it then.
I do live in London, and it's a necessity.
Yeah.
And Paris, I lived in Paris. It's even worse. You definitely have to learn to park there.
Yeah.
Parallel park.
Mind you, I now live in the country and I haven't had to parallel park for a long time, and I've changed my car and I haven't got the confidence to do it these days.
Well,
I need to have a practice where there's a lot of space.
I think that the problem is to overcome the pressure you have by the upcoming traffic while you're parallel parking. So that's what I found in Milan. I was born in Milan. I took my
yeah.
Yeah.
I thought you just all drove around in scooters.
No.
No? Is that not what they do in Italy?
I think
everybody goes.
I think Italian drivers are unique. I have driven in Sicily and all over Italy, and I confident driver, but they're mad there. They're crazy. Crazy, aren't they?
I know. It depends. In the south, there are no rules. So you make your own rules. In the north, they are more disciplined, but they are in a hurry. Especially in Milan, you have to do quick. Nobody has patience to wait. That's overwhelming, really.
I went to Barcelona once and I watched them parallel park. And the way they did it was they went in really slowly. They bumped the car behind and then they went forward and bumped the car in front.
That's what happens in Paris.
And then got into the space. You know, they didn't cause any damage, but that was the technique.
Is that not how you're supposed to do it? That's how I do it.
No, Jamie.
No, but hey, it's all right.
Okay, give me 2 wee seconds, guys, because I've got it, but it's on my phone because I couldn't find it on the internet.
Jamie?
Hello?
Hello. Can I just say, my sister was on the injections. She started them after my brother-in-law got put on them because he was diabetic. So she then started to pay for them. And she just felt nauseous the whole time she was on them. But she stuck with it, and she lost 2.5 stone. And then as soon as she can afford to keep them going, she came off, and she said she wanted to eat the furniture. She was that hungry that she just ate and ate and ate, and now she's put on more weight than she had before the injections.
Okay.
So
you see what I mean?
Complete waste, complete waste of time, complete waste
They're
of time.
not cheap, are they? They're like, my friend did them for her daughter's wedding. £200 a month or something?
Yeah, £200 a month.
She lost 2.5 stone.
Yeah, my sister lost 2.5 stone. I just think
£200 a month if you do it privately. That's what my friend paid. She's a matron at a hospital in London. Yeah. And so she's a medical person.
I know, my sister is. Yeah,
she
my
took
sister,
crazy. She took them for 4 months, 5 months.
Yeah.
To lose the weight for her daughter's wedding. She hasn't put much of the weight back on because she has got that mindset now where she sees a portion and she says, I'll eat half of it. Even though she's no longer on the drugs. But
my sister hasn't got that. My sister's a lead nurse, a senior lead nurse in a cancer hospital. So she knows she has to sit with people and tell them that they're terminally ill. And she knows what she's, and yet she's a beast. She's so overweight that I just think, for the money that she spent, she could have spent the money on TSD.
Yeah.
And dealt with what is underlying with her eating, because
my master's dissertation, I actually looked at the health of the NHS staff. That was what my dissertation was on. And I found that over 67% of NHS staff, frontline NHS staff, are overweight or obese.
Yeah.
So I did. They're the least healthy of all the health
services
or the public services.
But if you look at the food in the NHS hospitals, I mean, let's face it, the stuff they give the patients is disgusting. Yeah, I've been there quite a lot recently over the last few years with my father. And if you're there day in, day out, 24/7 with somebody that's really poorly, what do you get to eat? There is nothing. There's a cost of coffee and
sandwiches.
Sandwiches. It's disgusting. It's. Don't let me get on my soapbox. I have to stop because I worked for the Department of Health on a project, and I was appalled at the lack of knowledge and lack of empathy for things, and it was quite shocking. Yeah, quite shocking. And I just think a lot of things could be solved if they did more prevention and spent money wisely rather than.
Yeah, it's about education, isn't it? It really is.
But it's education at a younger age as well.
Yeah, but then NHS workers should have that education.
A lot of that's also overridden by the shift patterns too.
Shift patterns.
And
not being able to get
are working like 14 hours a day and not getting paid.
And then add the cortisol into it, and you've got a perfect storm.
Yep. Can everyone see the full obesity system map?
We can see it, but it's tiny. And
right, yeah.
Right.
It's kind of hard to show it, but
can you send it to us, Jamie, in a link sometime?
Yeah, these are all the contributing factors that would sort of contribute to it. I wonder if I can. Oh, I can attach a file in here.
Zooming in, but
hold on, everyone. Hold on. There we go. I post it in the chat. You can see it. It's taking me a minute there, but can everyone see that now? It's in the chat as like you can download the image. You can see like the complexities of what contributes to obesity and all the things that you have to. But these are all things that you would sort of be overcoming as well. You don't realize it. You think it's as easy as maybe like, or maybe you downplay how much that you're actually working against, because like there's a reason why we say that we live in a obesogenic environment, is because most of the things in our local and sort of global environment are overwhelmingly pushing us towards obesity. So they are.
There was the Christmas lectures by those doctor twins were quite interesting. I don't know if they're still on BBC iPlayer. I don't know if anyone saw them.
Oh, ultra processed.
Yeah.
Ultra processed life. Yeah. You'd actually, one of the things that would turn your stomach would be if you were to see the sort of the influence some of those global organizations have, you know, the lobbying influence they have. And it's not really been widely publicized, but if you were to go and look at the government had laid out an obesity framework for addressing obesity. And earlier, I think this year, or it might have been, it might have been, no, it would have been last year, they announced that they were scrapping that framework. So they were. And a lot of that is likely down to lobbyists on behalf of those organizations. And part of that was actually certain things like reducing ads that targeted children and things like that as well. And they seem to have ditched most of that.
Yeah.
They have, you know, for the sake of money. So it doesn't matter who you vote for, they're all useless, is what I'm trying to say. They're all useless, which is a sad state of affairs. So it is. But was the presentation itself, was that interesting? I know, and again, I appreciate that it was quite a niche subject, so it was everyone, but did it sort of shine a light a little bit on those drugs and how they work at least, so that you sort of understood those? And
Yeah.
you know, the interesting thing is a lot of the, not maybe to the same degree, but there are certain changes you could make that would also have like similar effects, you know, through your diet. So you can sort of make changes to your diet that would also stimulate the release of like the GLP-1 hormone. So that's going to be like increasing maybe your dietary protein, for example, or having more voluminous foods in your diet. So those would be the ones that are relative to their energy contribution, they're much higher in food volume. So it's like if you were to have, what's a good comparison? So like say a banana, for example, is like 120 odd calories, 150 calories, give or take. And again, this isn't to say that one's bad, one's good, but it's just making those sort of decisions. If you were to take that same amount of energy and maybe apply that to say having berries instead, you would probably have like a much greater portion of the berries, which would then help to sort of further increase that GLP-1 secretion. You would see more benefits potentially to blood glucose regulation, you know, satiety, reductions in urges and cravings and things like that. And then there's other sort of components of the foods as well to factor in, like the fiber content, you know, difficult to digest elements of sort of the likes of whole foods as well. And then, yeah, fiber as a whole would also be great. You know, protein, fiber, and voluminous foods tend to be sort of your best bets for increasing that sort of GLP-1 secretion, and then regular exercise. Apart from that, you'll also want to just make sure that your sleep's on point. Sleep is very important in the regulation of the hunger and satiety hormones, ghrelin being the hunger hormone. Just remember, ghrelin is like your tummy grumbling. So just remember that one. And leptin is the hormone that tells you that you're full. So better sleep promotes more or improved regulation of those. So you'll tend to feel less hungry and more satiated after you have a meal. Whereas the inverse is true if you have poor sleep. And then you also have to deal with sort of less regulated blood glucose levels as well as that. So then you have urges and cravings and sort of other drivers of increased food intake with poor sleep. So you do. So basically what I'm saying is try and get a good night's sleep.
Yeah.
Exercise regularly and have mostly nutritious food in your diet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Always comes back to the boring but basics, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Always back to basics.
Yeah, underneath all the waffle, always comes back to the basics. So it does.
Yeah.
But yeah, does anyone have any sort of last wee questions, guys, or whether it be on the presentation or anything else, or are we sort of happy enough to wrap it up there, or?
Yeah, that's fine.
Kind of happy enough.
Yeah.
Side effects of these injections. It's one thing they don't really talk about, having had to take those medication that sort of races the fat through your body, which is quite unpleasant.
Mm-hmm.
I can't think of the name, sorry.
Is that the oh, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, it stops fat absorption.
Oh, what is it?
And I can't think of the name of it
It's right on
either.
the tip of my tongue, so it is, Pamela. I know what you're talking about, because basically, this is going to be disgusting, guys, but whenever you go to the toilet, you see that fat coming out of your bottom.
It is totally gross.
Oh,
It's
wow.
just awful.
What is it bloody called?
Oh God, I can't remember what it's called, but I took it and yeah, it is foul. And sometimes you couldn't even control it. It would just come out when you're sleeping. Awful, awful.
Yeah,
Oh my goodness.
yeah, it was
But,
dreadful.
it was supposed to be a deterrent to stop you eating fat so that it never came out of you. But yeah, it was pretty gross.
What was it you took?
Yeah.
Oh gosh, it was
I'm trying to
years
Google
and
it.
years ago.
Orlistat.
Orlistat.
Orlistat,
That's it.
that's the one.
That's it.
Don't take Orlistat.
Oh.
It's the most disgusting thing you'll ever see whenever you go to the bathroom, and it doesn't actually really work. That's the other thing. There's not much in the way of showing that it's massively effective. So there's not. It just leads to you having a bit of a runny bum, which I think we'd rather not have that.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
no.
No, thank you. It's been helpful because
Yeah.
it also explains why some of my friends are on it, because of what because of the type of overeating they've done.
Yeah.
One of them was force fed by her husband, and I think she's developed a real unhealthy relationship with food. So, and she's diabetic. So yes,
Mhm.
because she was saying you got to try this, you got to try this, but I'm not seeing a major effect on her. I've lost more than she has.
Yeah.
Doing TSD for 3 months.
Yeah.
You
Well,
can
that's
often
what you
see,
need to sort of pick apart the drivers of the behaviors. It's not what she's doing, it's why she's doing it that she needs to.
But
Yeah.
you'll often see when people are on it, their face goes very thin very quickly. Like, what's that woman, Osborne woman, that did it
Oh.
and has overdone it now?
Yeah. Sharon
Osborne, yes. And that's obviously to do with the muscle mass loss. Is that right, Jamie?
Yeah, a lot of it's to do with just like very sort of extreme deprivation in the short term. So you'll see like you've sort of said, Deborah, there is a lot of lean muscle mass loss. Now you can't deny that there is fat sort of lost alongside of that, but again, when you're talking about the longevity component of that, it's works while you're on the drugs, but it's going to make it a lot harder whenever you're in that sort of transition phase, not just out of the weight loss, but also away from the drugs too, because whenever you lose that amount of lean muscle mass, you have sort of real consequences to your resting metabolic rate and how much energy you're actually able to sort of expend, because you're losing a lot of that metabolically active tissue. So your daily energy expenditure would naturally come down. So what you maybe would have eaten before to maintain your weight is a lot less, which is a lot harder to stick to, because it's not like your hunger and satiety sort of, hormones will necessarily adjust to that as well. So your cravings are going to exceed the amount of energy that you would maybe need to maintain. And also you'll not be able to move or expend the same amount of energy, with movement, because you've got less muscle mass and you're more at risk of hurting yourself too, or general injury. So yeah, but then again, that's another one of those cases of misuse, and a lot of that's driven by, particularly sort of like in the celebrity spheres, it's to do with, needing to look a certain way rather than needing to function a certain way, So, it's hard to feel sorry for them though, because they're the ones that create those standards to begin with. So they're kind of like a victim of, what are they, a victim of the monster they created, essentially. You know, so I'd say most of that probably lands on the foot of the Kardashians at the moment, considering what influence they've had on beauty standards and particularly how women are supposed to look, which is not even how they look, because most of them are like plastic. So it's mad. The whole thing's mad. So it is. But yeah, I wouldn't be taking drugs to look like Sharon Osbourne or Kelly Osbourne. I don't
They
think
look hideous.
I think they just look so unhealthy because they probably are. You know. But again, it's another example of that misuse. I mean, there's plenty of people who have benefited from these drugs because they use them in the right way. You know, they should be more or less like a stepping stone for some people who just need a real hand up. They shouldn't be, like I said, a panacea or a lifelong solution, because that's not what they were designed for. But anyway, quite depressing presentation this morning.
No, it's interesting.
Anyone
But
have any jokes?
I thought it was really interesting to understand better what's going around it. So
yeah. Anyway,
don't
I
put
have to
yourself
start
down.
work. Bye, everybody.
Yeah, I think everyone's needing to start work, and I think everyone's done with me. So we'll wrap it up there. So we will, guys. If anyone has any questions though after the fact or needs anything, you know, just message your coach or message me. And if you're watching this and it's recorded, apologies, it has been a little bit depressing, but if you have a question, just get your coach to message me as well. And hopefully everything made sense here, guys. And I will be back to do another presentation the first Thursday in March. So you have plenty of...
Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie.
Jamie.
Bye.
All right, cheers,
Bye.
guys. Bye-bye. 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 Bye-bye.